Hello, today I'm going to use our new John Innes range to prick out some seedlings and to pot on some houseplants. It's the most beautiful day right at the end of February, actually quite warm for the time of year, and a good day to get on with some of these basic gardening tasks. What I'm going to do with these chillies, with chillies it's a long season crop. It takes a long time for them to get from seed to actually producing, and so you need to start early and then need to get them potted on as they grow, as they've got their first true leaves are now present. For this is called pricking out. So to raise the seeds, they were raised in the John Innes seed compost, and now I'm moving on to the John Innes number 1. It's got slightly more fertiliser, slightly coarser structure. It's a mixture of sterilised loam, our composted wood and bark, and some potting grit, together with enough fertiliser to keep them going, but not so much that they'll get a nasty shock and too much too soon. Now, I need to be very delicate with these because we want to keep the root systems nice and intact. And that I find just by squeezing the compost, it naturally breaks up. So a little bit of compost in the pot, always with seedlings. Hold them by the leaves rather than the stem. The leaves are, you don't want to spoil the leaf, but they are expendable, whereas the stem obviously isn't at all expendable. It's absolutely needed. So there we go. Now, just a light firming to stabilise the plant. One of the best ways to do that is just to tap it. So on we go, a little bit of compost in the pot. Again, use the leaf to hold the plant. You can use a dibber for this, or your finger. Just make a nice hole. Let the compost settle around, and on we go. There we are. And those will stay in there for a few more weeks, and then I'll take them to the next pot size up. You will be familiar with the advice always with plants not to over pot, not to go from a seedling, for instance, into a much bigger pot. Now, why is that? Because that would, on the face of it, save the hassle of having to do yet another potting on and another. If you've got a vigorous plant, if this was a tomato seedling, and tomatoes are very vigorous, they'll root very happily, you could probably get away with going from seedling into bigger pot, because that plant is vigorous. With something less so, and also something that is very much needs warmth, the danger of overpotting is that the roots can only occupy a small volume of compost at the beginning, and you run the risk with all that compost around that hasn't got roots in it. The moisture isn't being drawn out by the plant, so that area of compost unused can sit rather wet and rather cold, and particularly for a warm country thing like a chilli, they hate the cold, and that's the sort of thing that could really prevent them actually growing very well at all. So it's not just things like chilies, anything that's a little bit tentative in its root growth, a bit slow. You need to be very careful not to overpot, not to get that wet area, remembering that a wet compost warms up more slowly than a dry one. And so if the compost isn't having the water drawn out of it by the plant, the roots mining the area for the water, it is likely to be sitting wet, and that won't do the plant any good at all. So that's for shy rooters. Anything that's vigorous, you can be a little less careful about it. So once they're potted, don't forget to give them a nice water, get them settled in. That'll be enough. The John Innes takes up the water quite easily. With watering, always don't water until the water is pouring out of the bottom of the pot, because all you're doing is washing away nutrients, but that'll be enough for now. Job done. I want now to move on to potting on a couple of houseplants that I bought as little baby houseplants in tiny little pots back last year. This lovely Miranda, it's been sitting in this pot very happily, but it's ready for potting on, and the spring is a good time to do it. It's beginning to put out new leaves. The day length is increasing, but again, we don't want to overdo it. It's a warm country plant, it's a house plant, so it needs not to be put into a pot that's way too big for it. And here, for this, I'm now using our potting on compost, which is number 2. Slightly more fertiliser in it than number 1. It'll keep the plant going, but again, with all of these, we can only put a starter amount of fertiliser in them. You do have to liquid feed after about 4 to 6 weeks in order to keep the plant very happily fed and performing to its best. So pop the plant in, give it a nice shake which will settle it enough. The one thing with compost is plant roots need as much air as they do water. If you press down too hard, you get rid of all those spaces in the compost that will hold the air that the plant needs. So best thing to do is just firm it gently, but then give it a shake, and that'll settle it in. And I'm now going to just pop that in a nice pot. There we go. Now this one, likewise, same thing. You can see this one is beginning to come into its spring growth. The day length is encouraging it to start growing, and you can see how really it's really outgrown this pot now. So same thing with both of these. The compost that they've been in is largely exhausted, really. So what I did yesterday was give them a good liquid feed, so that this part of the compost has also had some fresh fertiliser by way of the liquid feed. Because when we pot on into the compost, obviously there's this big area that hasn't got the benefit of all the fertiliser that's in the new compost. So if you've got the time and you can do it, give something like this a good liquid feed the day before you pot on. Get it nice and moist. You don't want a dry root ball going into wetter compost. Give it every chance to perform to its best. Pop it in. Make sure that the compost comes up to the same level as on the stem as it did before. Gently pop the compost. This Johninus flows very freely, so it goes down the sides of the old pot, the old compost, very easily. And again, a gentle tap, and there we have, ready to go. And both of these houseplants, there'll be enough fertiliser in there, having had the liquid feed yesterday, the new compost today, those will be fine. I won't be giving them any more liquid feed for probably 6 weeks at least. But there we go, and that's a nicely structured compost. It'll do well for both of those houseplants for many weeks to come. So having potted the houseplants, they need watering in. I've actually put some slightly tepid water in this watering can. Don't use freezing cold water on your houseplants. It'll be a nasty shock, they won't like it at all. But just get those nicely watered in. And there we can see them ready to go. Let the water run out before you pop them in the container, because the last thing any houseplant wants, most of them anyway, is to be sitting in wet conditions.